Welcome to the D word by Peace Vigil. D stands for difference, a word that is often the cause for fear, divisions, and even violence. In this series, we talk to people about their experiences with difference, how it impacted their lives, and what they think of it. If you like this discussion, please do remember to like, subscribe, and share with your friends. Is it possible to be committed to someone else's cause? That's the question we explore in this episode of The D Word, which is a discussion between our co-director Shirin and Alena Kahle.
Welcome to The D Word by Peace Vigil. Today we'll talk to Alena Kahle, a young woman from Germany who has been actively promoting causes of justice in India. She has organized and participated in many actions in Europe to bring attention to the erosion of democracy and the rise of fascism in India. She was neither born in India, nor does she have any family ties with that country. Alena, as you know, when I first got to know you, I wrongly assumed that you must be part Indian for you to take such close interest in what is happening in India and how things can improve there. I was pleasantly surprised that you have no family connection with India, and yet you are so interested in what's happening there. Tell me, have other people also made this mistake?
Shirin, this is wonderful to be here. I feel really honored that I get to be in a series called Difference, D-Word. It really makes me feel very humbled, so thanks for that. Yes and no. Like, it's not a very common thing that happens, but people do sometimes assume that I'm Indian, even though physically, I'm very white and I'm very tall. So people really are confused about what is she doing here. She doesn't really look like she belongs here, but she kind of does know a lot. So I'm going to guess she's Indian. It's a thing that does happen. Once when I went to a train station in Delhi and I went to buy a train ticket in Hindi, the conductor looked at me and was like, "Ma'am, aap Kashmir se hain?" So, "Ma'am, are you from Kashmir?" Because he just couldn't fathom that I, a foreigner, would be able to speak the local language. And when I said, "No, I'm not Kashmiri," his next assumption was, "Oh, then she must be from Iran, maybe." And only later did he come up with the possibility that this person could have actually learned Hindi as a language. It's not apparently it doesn't seem to be a very common thing. Like, there are a lot of white people involved with India who have a similar history to me, I suppose. But what they do is rather like development work or aid work or something like that, or gender rights and things like that. And I suppose my profile is different to that, which makes me seem out of place. And then the only answer is, well, she must have some tie. But that is not the case, as you pointed out.
And Alena, the other thing is that your last name, you have told me how it is pronounced, but if you just look at Kahle, somebody might think it's like a Maharashtrian last name. We do have last names similar to yours. So I think some people may think, okay, maybe she's mixed. She's like part Indian and part European.
Especially because my first name appears to be Russian. I have no ties to Russia. I have no ties to anything Soviet, but apparently my first name is Russian. And there is a history of Russia and India and, a lot of Russians going to India. So it is an assumption that could make sense. I admit it's not too far-fetched.
Yeah, we do see white people who are interested in what's happening in India, but it's mostly the developmental work or say projects that they do, poverty and so on. But you do something different. So please do tell us, what is your involvement with India?
Big disclaimer that I did first get introduced to India through quite a white savior trope. I had graduated high school and thought I really wanted to go out into the world and help other people. You know where this is going. I spent a year in Delhi in a not-formal education center, working with very adorable little kids, very stereotypical, and wanted to, assist them get an education. So that is how this all started. But then I lived in a neighborhood with Afghan refugees. I lived and worked very close to Shaheen Bagh, which is where the Citizenship Amendment Act protests kind of had their hot spot with all the women, just the entire sit-in. And I traveled just on a random holiday, traveled around the country and got to learn a lot about wonderful people doing wonderful work. But also I wanted to go to, Jharkhand. I wanted to go to Chhattisgarh and just see the country there. But everybody kept telling me, like, no, it's too dangerous. You can't go there. So I started asking a lot of questions. Innocent questions, I think, just about, okay, why is this society the way it is? Why is this culture the way it is? Why would Modi do such a thing as demonetization, which happened while I was there? And I was like, this is a stupid policy. I want to know more about it. So I started reading and researching and realizing that these little things that I had observed were much bigger than I had ever feared, and were symptoms of structural problems that couldn't just be addressed through, writing an essay about them. So at some point I decided, hey, that was in the middle of the CAA protests, I gotta go do something. But I want to know what I can do about all these things that I've been reading and learning about. And that's how I ended up at a anti-CAA protest in The Hague in front of the embassy, and met the wonderful people of the progressive Indian diaspora. And since then, it's just kind of been rolling as we find more and more things where we can do projects, contact members of the European Parliament about, create dossiers, create workshops to inform members of the European Parliament and domestic European parliaments about issues. But I've also done, tried to kind of get the diaspora together, because I was so sad to see that many of my Indian friends that I had made during the time that I lived in India, that they didn't really think there was anybody out there in the diaspora who wasn't Hindutva, or who wasn't kind of supportive of the Modi regime. And I was like, no, I literally just met them at a protest. They exist. But my friends back in India didn't know. And I started trying to rally people together of the diaspora, and we started having roundtables every once in a while to collaborate the actions, and got together with another diaspora movement that had a kind of group together in the United States. And we learned from each other, and I learned from them, and they embraced me in such a wonderful way that I felt, hey, I feel at home here. So, for instance, when you Shireen, said that you thought that I was Indian, because why else would I be involved? I do feel like I've found a home with this community. So perhaps that's why I'm so dedicated to it, because people are quite wonderful, and I want them to achieve the goals that they're trying to achieve.
Alena, I wonder what your family thinks of all this.
So my family has quite a political background. That is, almost every single member in my family is in some way engaged with some kind of cause. Most of it is local politics, municipal politics, something about just managing the daily workings of a democracy, something like that. My parents were very involved in the church, so all these rather local small causes. And then there's me taking on a big, I'm going to do human rights in India type of thing. But still, I do fit within this thing in my family of everybody kind of having their pet project that they take on and keep for their entire life. I grew up with my parents always having meetings in the evenings, with my parents always kind of going to the next, church assembly or meeting of mothers at the school to organize, to advocate for a different type of teaching format, those types of things. There's always been something that people around me and my family were doing and encouraging me to do. So even when in puberty, I went through quite the emo goth phase. But my family was like, well, she's socially involved though. She's engaged with things. She has her passions that are about the wider social structures. So it's fine,
Bravo.
whatever she looks like.
Bravo.
Precisely. Big shout out to them for that. But I do sometimes feel like the things that I'm campaigning for are inherently at odds with Western imperialist interests, obviously, and therefore the well-being of people living in Europe. If everybody represents their own interests, then everybody's interests are represented. That would be the ideal. Like, you advocate for your cause, the other person advocates for their cause. And that works well if everybody has an equal power dynamic. But the West has, for so long, with their interests that are represented, dominated other interests. And hence, I'm kind of trying to fight against some of the trends and dynamics that have been actively caused by like Western capitalism and neoliberal governance, et cetera, which have been exported abroad.
I guess, I'm just trying to push ourselves back a little bit and try and understand the history of colonialism in this context and the privileges that white people enjoy or have enjoyed for a long time because they controlled Asia and Africa and Latin America. And I'm wondering if that's the kind of thing that you're getting at. I mean, of course, the neoliberal policies and capitalism at play right now is very important, but I think it's a history of hundreds of years, don't you think?
It is. What I'm getting at is that when I'm advocating against corporate human rights violations in, I don't know, Jammu and Kashmir or Gujarat, or against the Gujarat development model, that this is directly at odds with what, for instance, people around me in domestic German politics would be advocating for, which is more development and GDP growth and stuff like that. So the local politics is kind of at odds with the narrative that I have. And I do think that creates some tensions. But the question you're bringing up about colonialism, imperialism, and exploitation itself is incredibly important, because here I am trying to, help the cause of those who have been historically marginalized to benefit me and to benefit where I am nowadays. And I do feel like I owe a little bit. I owe people to kind of pay them back for that, even though it's not my fault. And I hope that we get to talk a little bit more about how this guilt kind of developed, because I think it has to do with the German education system that I underwent and the emphasis in history.
Yes.
Let's do that. Let's talk about that.
I would love to know more about it. In fact, I thought about it. I was like, okay, this is a German girl. I need to ask her about what they are taught, because I've been told, so I have no direct understanding of the education system there, but I've been told that the German education system does a pretty good job of talking about history. And it's not something that many countries do. For instance, here in South Africa, even though we are taught about apartheid, it's not done in a way and in the depth that I would like it to be done, because I think it is very important so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. So please do tell me about it. And by the way, Alena, I think it's very brave of you to admit that you and the people around you benefited from that past of colonial history and wanting to do something about it.
I share your appreciation of the German education system, but I also don't. To the extent that you just pointed out that it's wonderful and brave that I'm admitting my own privilege. This is something that only really happened in the past couple of years. So this is not because of the German education system that I've come to kind of encounter my own privilege and critically engage with it. Because in high school and elementary school, there were just white kids. There was like one person of color. She went to a different school at some point in middle school. It was purely white, maybe not entirely upper middle class, but still. Not very diverse is what I'm trying to say. And engaging with privilege was not something that was done. It's not that I forgot that it happened. I'm pretty sure that it didn't happen. So it was only through my university education and workshops and going abroad to India and the workshops that accompanied that, that I started to engage with my privileges. But I do share your optimism about the German education system in regard to the way that we were taught history. I still think that it is taught as history. So modern day colonialism throughout like modern day colonialism because of capitalism, that's not really discussed because Germany is built on capitalism. Or the, modern day discrimination against people of color in Germany, that's not a topic either. But the way that history is taught does make issues with remembering, these politics of remembering, very, very, very present. I didn't have the best history teacher, but I had fantastic French and Spanish teachers who thought, well, we can teach our students like French and Spanish through any kind of book or any type of novel. But they decided to choose novels and books to read in class together that directly talk about historical injustices. With French, we had a book about France's and Paris's banlieues, so kind of the suburbs in Paris, and about the politics of decolonization and the politics of belonging that came with the process of decolonization in France. So you had a teacher who was like, yeah, let's learn French this way. Let's also learn about colonial history in the same context. And I think my final exam was about the French Antilles, something like that, where I had to write an essay about kind of this politics of belonging thing. It was a 6-hour exam. It was crazy. So I had to study a lot for this about French colonial history. And the same with Spanish. I think we learned through a novel, again, in Spanish class, about the forced disappearances of children and people in Argentina, about the dictatorships in South America. So knowing that history, you always have to be selective with what you teach. These teachers thought, well, they're probably not going to learn about Southern American dictatorships, so let's do that in our Spanish class. And that is quite wonderful. History classes itself that I had were very much based on primary sources, on reading letters that people wrote during the Third Reich, that people wrote during the Nazi regime. I remember we had this one page from a kid's book that we looked at, which showed a cartoon, and on the left side, there was a picture of a very good-looking, stereotypical German guy with blonde hair, blue eyes. And there was a description next to it, something in poetry form, that, this is the role model you should be aspiring to be. And on the other side of the children's book page was a fat, greasy businessman with the description that this is a Jew, and this is what you should not be aspiring to be. So we looked at the sources that existed in the time where there was a lot of oppression and really engaged with that. We had, I think this might be interesting for Peace Vigil as peace educators. We had these simulations at some point. This is all, when we were 16, 17 years old, not earlier. But these simulations where we were assigned a role, imagine you are a politician in Nazi Germany. It's 1932 or 33 or something, and Hitler's just about to get his power, and you're told to vote about whether he should get more power or less. And this is the context within which you're voting, and now you decide. And this really emphasized the personal responsibility that people have to not tolerate fascism, to not tolerate oppression, but also showed how incredibly difficult it can be. So I've always kind of wondered, if I was Sophie Scholl, or I don't know, if I was Rosa Parks, what would I have done? Or if I lived back then, what would I have done? And I have the benefit of having a grandmother who is now 98 years old. She's really old. She's almost 100 years old, which means that during the Nazi regime, she was a young woman, she was my age. And she doesn't talk about it much. And I don't think she wants to, but I remember asking her some questions about, so what was it like for you back then? Did you have any moral questions that you needed to deal with? And that really, really was encouraged by our education system to, if you have living relatives, talk to them.
This is really interesting for me, and you're very right. We should do these simulation exercises in Peace Vigil. In fact, I'll ask you to lead it next time in a workshop, since you are quite aware of.
Yes, let's do that.
Yes, you have participated in them and you know how they work. But this is exactly what I'm getting at. Well, first of all, kudos to your Spanish and French teachers that they did such a wonderful job. I wish you had a better history teacher, but just the fact that you had these books and these exercises were done, I'm sure that they did have a lasting impact. Maybe at that time, because you didn't have a great history teacher, maybe all that didn't sort of filter in, like what were these books and exercises trying to do. But now when you look back and the way you are explaining to me, I can see that, it did have an impact, and I wish other parts of the world were doing the same. What I want to know is, did any kids actually come back and say, well, I did talk to this relative and she said it was difficult. She wanted to say something, but she couldn't because she was scared. Or maybe there's a relative who said, no, I actually at that time believed that what was happening was right. I'd like to know that, what happened in the classrooms.
That happened for sure. Yes. It made for very interesting conversations. I did drop history at some point because I didn't have particularly good grades and I had the opportunity to drop it. So probably if I had stayed longer in history class, I would have learned even more. But what I remember from the compulsory history classes was that people did come, my peers did come to class and were like, yeah. So I just learned that my great grandfather was in the SS and was really active, and I don't really know how to process this. And interestingly, there was a big consensus in the classroom that there is individual, it went over to this debate about individual agency versus structures, and we talked elaborately about that, and therefore also did those simulations in order to get empathy for people who choose to engage in oppressive work and kill other people, but also see that this is not something that should continue. So it gave kind of a human perspective to atrocities. I kind of wish that we'd read Hannah Arendt's work in high school. We didn't. So I think that could, well, admittedly, we did read a lot about Nazi Germany, so adding another source on the list would have been a bit too much maybe. But Hannah Arendt's work really emphasizes this banality of evil, that people who are perpetrators of violence, yes, they have agency, they choose to do this, but it's not that they're purely evil. And for a lot of my classmates, this question of what is evil, what is not evil did surface a lot. But then again, we're teenagers, right? It's something that you engage with for a day and have a crisis over and then cry yourself to sleep. And then the next day you go and, I don't know, watch some movie at the cinema and eat popcorn and enjoy yourself again. So it's not something that profoundly makes a difference. And I think that's why once you graduate school, once you get to drop those courses and then you stop engaging with the topic, that's where the problem arises of people, again, getting recruited to fascism, getting recruited to neo-Nazism, voting AfD or NPD. That is a real problem in Germany, which I don't think any amount of high school history classes could solve, because it's this persistent engagement with the same questions that makes you a consistently socially engaged person who's not going to support fascism. Just doing it in high school or elementary school, I think people are easy to forget, even though they might engage very thoroughly with the questions at the time.
From what I can understand, you are advocating that this kind of teaching of history should continue well into adulthood. And perhaps, as we advocate in Peace Vigil, that there should be peace trainings in offices. And I'm not talking of conflict resolution, I'm talking of just understanding of peace issues. Understanding of hate and bigotry should happen in offices and in universities and around the dinner table. So one is that if you have thought of some specific ways by which this attraction to fascism, for various reasons, economic and otherwise, that this kind of attraction can be reduced and people can understand how terrible it is. So that's my one question. The second question is whether what is happening in India to you seemed like, what you had studied in your history books, and that perhaps that was a push for you to talk against all that is happening in India today.
I'm going to start with the second question. So I recently read a work on social mobilizations or kind of social movements by Dusty Spencer, and she had highlighted that people get mobilized around causes because they see parallels. That you'll see a bunch of people standing in front of the Hague embassy protesting the CAA who have nothing to do with India, but who come from other causes, who, for instance, are part of the Free Palestine movement, or who are part of, the anti-globalization movement, and who therefore see parallels in this one particular cause and go and want to support it. For me, I think it was the other way around. I didn't really have this view of a lot of global things that all link together and all were quite similar until I encountered India and then kind of read backwards. So I started off with very specific things. I saw the CAA. I saw the protests. I was like, oh my God, this is close to where I used to work. I wonder if my Muslim colleagues are okay. Texted them. They got back to me saying, yeah, we're fine, but I have a friend who was at Jamia, and at Jamia there was the violence, the shooting, people storming the campus, throwing tear gas grenades. And I was like, oh my God, Jamia, that's where one of my other colleagues was. So I contacted her, and then they all told me more and more things, and I started seeing all these parallels. And only then did I realize, whoa, this is basically how Germany started. This is how the Israel-Palestine conflict has been playing off for a while when it comes to kind of Kashmir occupation. This is how enforced disappearances happened in Argentina. I didn't see the links initially. I only saw them later when I'd already become committed to the cause in India. And I think that's quite interesting because I didn't see the parallels for like a month or how long. I didn't see them immediately. And you would think that I would have, right? You would think that I saw the BJP's rise to power through pogroms, through violence, and be like, yep, that's exactly what I learned in high school.
So Alena,
but I only realized that later.
Yeah, I want to interject here. As a peace educator, I find that many times it is happening in our minds and we don't know. I have noticed this many times with communalism and racism, for instance. So people who have, especially the minority communities, I find that this, feeling belittled, feeling like they are not appreciated, they are not taken as human beings, that pain and the hurt, they immediately identify with movements against racism. They may not know it, but I've noticed that it happens. Maybe somewhere in the back of our mind, whatever our education system or our teachers or our parents have told us, it may not click at that time, but the fact that we are drawn may have something to do with our experiences, maybe not as somebody who suffered, but somebody who learned about it. So not always as a victim, but sometimes just as somebody who learned about those things and felt deeply about it.
I even think that it might be like a neurochemical connection. When you have an emotion or this feeling for justice, the striving for wanting to see an improvement in the world, I suppose that does leave a pathway in the body. And when something similar, some similar trigger comes in, that same emotion gets revived and that drive to do something about it. So as a kid, I was quite impulsive. I think I still am. And I felt very, very, very strong emotions about everything and had a huge savior trope. I wanted to save all the plush animals that were broken, that were like had a, I don't know, where the plush was coming out of the plush animal. I wanted to have those plush animals and fix them. And I think this need to, like this emotion of, oh, this is wrong, I want to do something about it, got very cemented. So perhaps that leads, like that builds on to what you were saying of having empathized, having learned how to empathize, and this ability to empathize, that creates a subconscious commitment and a subconscious realization that, oh, this is something that I should be, concerned about, because I have felt this feeling of concern before, and then it led me to do this and this. But hey, just throwing theories in the room here. But about your second question.
Yeah. No, I guess I should mention that I have seen that happen to people where they don't know why they are interested in something, but there's something in the past that like you're saying, those pathways are created. It also happens with crime, by the way. You see a crime happen or something's happened to you, and you see the same being repeated to somebody totally unrelated to you, but you immediately act, or you tell that person, hey, be careful, mind your purse, this has happened to me, somebody took my phone or whatever. So, even in those instances, that memory comes back.
I think this is quite hopeful, actually, because it shows we can mobilize together, even if the experiences are like different and on different continents and in different contexts. We can still mobilize around those experiences and really get to action. And I think that's my answer to your other question of concrete things that can be done. I really only got into and concerned about India because I was encountered with people who might have suffered because of the BJP's politics, because I developed close, intimate friendships and saw firsthand how my friends were suffering, yes, but also how my friends were partially like supporting the fascist government a little bit, and that made me worried. So really just this encountering and seeing it in a 3D manner really, really shaped how I engage with the injustice I hear about. And I mean, this is a super old dogma that if you want people to overcome enmities and promote peace and stuff, get people together and talk. So perhaps my idea isn't that innovative, but I affirm it again and again, that meeting new people, traveling, reading stories, watching movies, documentaries, novels where people are facing something that is unjust, that really gets people together and gets people to transform their political opinions and actions.
When you said that you had friends who were suffering because of CAA, and you also had friends who supported CAA, it is ultimately coming down to you as an individual, that even though you have friends on both sides, which is the side that you're going to stand with. And I think that's where you have already gone beyond thinking only in terms of, okay, my friends being impacted. So that is the transformation that is needed, because just as we know, there were people in Nazi Germany who were benefiting from the system and yet decided to stand against it, and sometimes even stood against their own family members and so on in this. So, I'm trying to understand that, when is it that one starts to see beyond just our friends? So in the beginning, it could be because your friends were being impacted, but as you're saying, you also had friends who supported the system. And I think that's when we go beyond the personal and it becomes a political understanding. What happened to those friends? I'm sure they're not your friends anymore.
Ooh, yes. So one of the people who did tacitly support the Modi government and kept telling me, oh, you got to see both sides, or, oh, it's not as easy as you think, Alena. Oh, you can't demonize people. Like, God, politics are more complicated than you're making them out to be. Kind of the same trope that Modi, on the day of today's recording, said. Modi had a speech in which he said, like, human rights are being presented in a skewed manner, in a non-representational manner. That argument was put to me by my boyfriend at the time. So one of the people that I have unfortunately cut out of my life was, because of politics and values, was a person that I was deeply in love with. So when you say that they probably aren't my friends anymore, yeah, that happened. I did brutally cut somebody out, even though he had very close friends who were Muslims. He had queer friends. He had probably done it friends. Actually, I'm not aware. Probably not. On second thought, probably not. But I still tried to find excuses for why he was supporting the BJP in the way that he was. But the more I thought about it, I think it's because I was so close to him that I really wanted to know if there is a reason for him to support the BJP in the way that he did, which was just through his vote and through like telling me, oh, Alena, you're exaggerating. So it wasn't like supporting on the streets going to protests, but still I wanted to know why he was doing this. And I kept reading and reading and reading. And the more I read, the more I realized I can't find a reason to excuse this. I really do not know how to justify his, like, I realized more and more that his and my values are just deeply different. So it was through very thorough engagement with the question that was prompted because I was trying to save my relationship, basically.
It's very,
I decided to cut him out.
Yeah, no, this is actually very, very interesting, Alena. I do feel that many of us face that dilemma, because we really don't want to lose our connections with people that we like or we love. But a friend once said she was told by a very close relative of hers that let's not lose friendship over politics. And she said, I would rather not lose humanity over friendship. And it stuck with me. And I think it's a difficult lesson, but it does pay in the long run because you keep your conscience alive and you can answer your conscience, right?
Exactly. So when you're asking why I made this step of just being like, oh, my friends are affected, to going out on the street and protesting and writing letters and making workshops and basically dedicating, I guess, like half of my week to advocating against deteriorating democracy in India, how that step happened, I think it's because I read and I read and I read and I tried to understand and I tried to humanize it. And the more I realized that I can't, there's big structures in place through, I don't know, British colonial laws that are now being abused, the UAPA being abused to incarcerate the BK16. Like, those are big structural problems that need a structural approach. And I can't just talk about, oh yeah, no, whatever, this one of my friends was affected. If I'm going to be committed to helping one friend, then I need to make the step. Otherwise, it's kind of a very hypocritical approach to that. So I think this comes with the education that we were talking about earlier, that peace education, history education, all of that needs to be continuous, because once you start engaging with one question, there needs to be sufficient resources to really think the process through. And I guess that this is something that also comes with me being highly educated, having been privileged, having had access to sufficient time and peace of mind and a safe environment to engage with these questions. Many people might not be able to do that. So that is an absolute prerequisite to being able to make the step that you're hoping people will make.
Alena, this also brings me to another question about engagement with society. I know that you are passionately interested in protecting our environment and making it better for all the species on the planet. So do tell me about that, your engagement with environmental politics.
Again, it has a very interesting background. So you know how earlier I said that, like, kind of the theory is that people have their own experiences and then they link it to the wider issues. I again took a totally different approach to getting into environmental issues, because as a teenager I really didn't care. I was like, yeah, environmental crisis, whatever, probably isn't as bad as people think. But then because of India, because of the stuff that I saw there, I got involved with the wider activist movement. And then I met some environmental activists who told me about how Indigenous people were being tortured for trying to protect the environment. And then I read more, and then I took other classes, and slowly, I started to become involved with environmental activism, which I 5 years ago would have never thought I would do because it was so remote. It was so far away from me, not just like physically, but also interest-wise. I really did not care. And now I am on the streets every single weekend with Extinction Rebellion and partners to really, really put my body out there because I'm so concerned about the planet. And it links so well with the wider problems we're facing in society. So I personally find the ecofeminist lens quite helpful about basically how the oppression of women, oppression of minorities, domination of the planet, how those are all linked because of a need to dominate, segregate, and kind of control everything around us, which is inherently, like in feminist terms, masculine. So the ecofeminist lens has really helped me piece together my understanding of the world and realize, for instance, what things really, really need to be tackled in a comprehensive way. As an example, I started working with the London Story, which is a organization, a think tank that was founded out of the anti-CAA protest movement. So it was really initially concerned with India and Indian human rights. And we've moved through disinformation, we've moved through environmental concerns and really packaged these all together to highlight to the European Parliament, the Dutch Parliament, etc., that you can't just put fines on one person and boom, all the problems will be solved. You can't just increase the price of carbon and all the problems will be solved. It needs to be this very, very packaged approach, very, very comprehensive approach. In the Netherlands, there is one factory which emits 6.3% of all of the Netherlands emissions. It's the biggest single polluter in the Netherlands. And incidentally, that polluter is the Tata steel factory. And the Tata steel factory is currently being sued in the Netherlands, but only for this one particular harm that they've done. Because, well, the legal system has its inherent flaws. You can't just, pack all the problems together and then sue them because of all of the problems. You have to be very particular. But what we're highlighting now is that these environmental and health concerns that Tata Steel is bringing to the Netherlands, that those are structurally so similar to the harms that Tata is causing around the world by funding, for instance, the Myanmar military with their genocide, by funding the BJP through their electoral fund, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm committed to the environmental cause because I realized how structurally similar the environment's domination is to the domination of minorities and women, et cetera, et cetera.
All these issues are so interconnected. I recently have been reading so much about this pride in Tatas, many of the Indians feeling like, oh, Tatas have reclaimed the, Air India, and look how much they're progressing in the world and so on, not realizing that Tatas are also basically reproducing the structures that have been exploiting people. It doesn't matter whether the exploiter is Indian or European. At the end of the day, he or she is an exploiter, making sure that the systems of privilege remain and that the majority are working and paying for the profits of a very, very tiny minority. It also makes me think about, what you started with when you were talking about capitalism and the structures that reinforce oppression. And in some ways, economy is really where we should be concentrating with regard to India, especially, because it's also one of the reasons why communalism or sectarianism has become so powerful. It's because of that widespread poverty and misery that capitalism is making worse, actually.
A couple of years ago, I was really not critical at all of capitalism. And I didn't see it as in any way related to the social struggles. So similar to the environmental crisis, I didn't really care. I was like, well, I care about human rights. Why should I be concerned about capitalism? And then when I started reading about communalism and communal riots and how those happened. For instance, in books by Christophe Jaffrelot or other big shots in the field of kind of Indian politics, Indian sociology writing, they highlighted through very, very thorough research that the economic liberalization of India directly increased kind of caste polarization and communalism between different religions and communal violence. And that's when I realized, wait, if this is a thing in India, maybe it's a thing abroad as well. And only through that did I start becoming critical of capitalism. And that then made me more critical of the climate crisis. And again, fueled this need for a structural approach. So everything is so closely interconnected with me, and really one building block led to another. But it was a learning process that has been intense over the past few years.
Alena, in your journey, has your understanding of your own identity changed? I'm very interested to know that.
Yes and no. So as I alluded to earlier, identity wasn't really ever an issue because I went to a school in Germany where the majority of people had exact same demographic as me. I was a little bit unique because I'd grown up in the United States. I'd lived there for 4 years as a small kid. So I was a little bit my identity was kind of I'm like you, but cooler because I was in the US. But that was all that was the extent to which I ever questioned my identity. But I do think that has changed because now this is a question people ask me. My identity comes up a lot. We started off with asking me Alena, do people think that you're Indian sometimes? And some people do, but more people are just confused. You don't sound German. You don't behave German. You don't drink beer? Are you sure you're German? That type of thing. So my identity has been questioned. And that's why I've been engaging more with the question of what is German even? And I don't identify as German. I have a little bit of a regional pride for Northern Germany because that is a special snowflake within Germany because we got cooler food. But that's the extent to which I identify as German. I primarily really feel like a woman. And that has been something that has been strengthened over the past few years. I identify less and less and less as the kind of citizen of something, and more as my gender, because I feel like the experiences that women have across the world, in their diversity and intersectionality, I do feel like I am uniting around that. Even though I feel less and less and less like a German citizen, it is something that I have to remind myself of constantly. It's not an active process that I'm oh wait, Alena, you're German, but more something that always again and again and again comes up. But as it comes up more and more, I keep thinking additionally more and more that what does it even mean to be German? Should this be part of my identity? Does it add anything to my identity? No, it doesn't.
Those are definitely deep thoughts, and I think we must engage with this understanding of self, because a lot of the politics that happens, the identity politics, is based on artificial boundaries. But Alena, also I'm thinking that in terms of what you first said about this savior mentality, how it had something to do with going to India in the beginning and trying to save the children there or doing something for the poor, how that has also changed. I'd like you to talk a little bit about that. This understanding of helping the other also has various connotations, right?
So when I went abroad for the first time, to India for the first time, that was accompanied by a very rigid workshop format. In order to be able to be accepted into this volunteering program, which is funded partially by the German government, which is kind of cool. But in order to go on that volunteering adventure, I first needed to attend a workshop, which was, I think, 12 days long. And in that workshop, one of the main things was engaging with my own saviorism. And I hated it at the time. I thought, oh my God, you're trying to tell me that I'm not doing development aid? you're underestimating me. And I had quite an arrogance, which is really sad. But it was because of those 12 days and the fabulous mentors who like thrust it down our throat that no, don't overestimate yourself. You're not as like, you don't even have a bachelor's degree. You're doing this after high school. Don't think that you have skills somebody else who's lived experiences that you've never had, that you have better tools to kind of fix their problems for them. That's just stupid. I really owe a lot of gratitude to those workshop mentors, as well as after I'd done the year of volunteering, I had incorporated a little bit more that, well, Alena, actually, you're here to learn. You're here to learn about other people's experiences and then share them with decision makers and people in Europe or wherever else your home is. I had processed that a little bit better. And then I went to university. My bachelor's degree was in international justice, which is kind of like international law, but cooler because we had a bunch of courses on sociology and gender and development and methodology from qualitative stuff and quantitative methodology. So it was an international law degree with a lot of fluff around it to show that, well, you may be committed to solving global challenges and problems, but you're never going to do that if you don't abandon the perspective that you know best. That was again thrust down my throat by wonderful, fabulous professors at Leiden University College The Hague. If anybody wants to apply, it's a fantastic program. Haha. I realized, I think this is why I read so much. That is why every single time you should ask me a question, I kept saying, oh yeah, then I read another book, or then I read another thing, because I tried to understand more and more what was going on. And I started a blog at some point just to be able to process my thoughts. And it has one article on it. What role does a white person have in the development sector? And it's just a very long kind of cry for, oh my God, help, I don't know what I'm doing. I thought that I know that I can help people. I thought that I know how I can help people, but actually I don't think that I have a place in this. I should probably just be a mouthpiece and talk about other people's suffering, not give solutions. And I remember my dad reading the article and calling me and being like, Alena, are you okay? Are you fine? Till I told him, Dad, it's because university told me that, I shouldn't be imposing my solutions on problems I've never experienced myself. And I still don't know what I'm doing. I still don't know how I'm doing this. But what I love is that I get feedback from other people who I tell, hey, I want to help you. And then they give me feedback and say, yeah, this is nice, or this is what I need. Or if a person tells me, I really need you to help get this in the press. What's happening in India, BK16, Stan Swami dying, for instance, we need this in the press. What can you do about this? I feel like this is a really nice confirmation of that I'm not completely in the wrong place and that I'm actually wanted. And recently, with in regards to the environmental causes, in northern Sweden, for instance, I currently live in Sweden, and in the north of Sweden live the Sami population. And they're an indigenous population who are barely known about. But they have their forests, which they would like to, conserve and have their reindeers in, but the Swedish state is cutting down the trees. And one of my friends has now been in contact with the Sami population and was like, I would be willing to help. Tell me when you need my help and I will do it. So instead of going there and being like, hey, I have this idea to do this and this and this, he tells them that he's available for support and then waits for them to get back to him with concrete ideas of what they would like. And I think that's a pretty viable idea, and also why I would love to itself work with people who are Indian if I'm working about India, or work with people who are Afghani if I'm working on Afghanistan, maybe, I don't know, in the future. Rather than working with, some NGO in Germany or the Netherlands, which is staffed entirely with white people who've all been to India and really are committed, because I feel more confident that if I have an Indian person, that they will be able to tell me better what's going on. But again, this is not I haven't completely thought this through. I know that within India, there's oppression itself. And I can't just say that because an Indian told me to send a press release about BK16, that this is something that will definitely help. I'm still processing this, and I'm very much still learning and trying to figure out what helping even is. But I'm sure that it has to do with listening.
Really good food for thought for anyone listening and wanting to do some good in the world. And I must say that your dad had a great idea telling you that don't impose your solutions, but talk to people and see what is needed. This reminds me of that very famous quote of Leela Watson, that if you have come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. I feel that that also applies to people who are coming from a space of privilege, because even if we come from a place of privilege, we still have to contend with our conscience, our history, and so on. And that we can be pained by what our ancestors did, or the system that caused these injustices. And we also have more than just one identity. So, like you said, that for you, being a woman is the most important part of your identity. So injustices there, the gender injustices, and all that is linked. Alena, also in one of our conversations, you had mentioned about mental health issues and how you dealt with them as a young, much younger person. You're still very young. But I'd like to know more about it and how you dealt with that phase.
I wish it was a phase. But you're bringing up a really good point that I think is one of the most, next to being in India, one of the most impactful things that ever happened in my life, which is that when I was around 14 or 15, you're going through a lot of changes yourself. Plus, then there's the entire uncertainty of the world, and sometimes that ends up being a severe mental health condition. And that was the case for two of my best friends and my boyfriend at the time, who all had crippling depression, and I kind of ended up being the support person. I know I'm very empathetic, but that was probably the reason why it screwed me up so much. I wanted to be the anchor. I wanted to be there for my friends and my boyfriend when they couldn't get out of bed in the morning, when they wanted to self-harm, when they wanted to take their life. I was the person that they went to because I called for it. I was like, yo, here, if you need any support, I'll be your anchor. And that really, really hurt me in a lot of ways. I lost a lot of weight, like 10 kilograms, and I'm already really skinny, so not very fun. And I developed my own other issues. But I think one thing that has significantly helped me out of that is being quite accepting of different responses people have, and also trying to tune in to what a person is feeling at any given moment. So when, I don't know, my best friend said, hey, let's meet up tomorrow, but then in the morning she didn't call me. She just didn't say anything and didn't show up. I didn't get mad. I didn't really know what else to do, but I then decided, okay, well, I'm going to have to accept that there's a diversity of responses, and whatever might be normal, I don't know, in my culture, is not something that I can expect from everybody. So I feel like this gave me a lot of tolerance towards different actions, different responses of people, and helped me tune into what people need, which I think, again, fueled this type of empathy and understanding for people. Maybe I'm just trying to find something wonderful out of the pain that I experienced. I don't know, but it was quite impactful.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you were able to find a way forward. I do feel that in this, building a community is very important. Often activists who are directly working with the grassroots, they find this, that their emotional well-being is not taken care of because, they really don't have anybody to talk to or anybody they could share their pain and hurt with, so they're absorbing all this pain and hurt, and they're trying to work with communities, but they don't have many people they could share their pain and hurt with. I feel that in that, building of a community is very important. I feel that at Peace Vigil, we have tried to do it in our own small way. So we have these peace lovers forums where people come and express themselves, whether through poetry or through art. The last one we had was on October 2. More of it needs to be done. Even from our end, we need to make more effort.
I wish that there were more kind of regenerative things that activists do together. We do want to treat this as something very serious, right? Activism. But we also shouldn't forget that this is taking more toll on our mental health and mental well-being than an average job would. So while we can say, oh, I'm going to full-time be an activist, full-time activist doesn't mean spending like 50 hours a week on just the activism tasks, but has to involve much, much more self-care. Unless you already have a really big like heart wall and you're already very immune to all of the emotional challenges. But I don't think that people who are that way would ever become so deeply involved with activism.
Yes. Alena, with this, I would like to bring this conversation to an end. But if there's something that you'd like to say to conclude.
I have learned quite a bit through Peace Vigil itself as well, which I wanted to acknowledge in this podcast or this conversation too. Peace Vigil does fantastic workshops that I have learned a lot from, and I hope that other people can have the same experience and get practical tips, because we all have knowledge that we need to share with each other if we want to make all of this work and make a real change.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alena. As we say, peace needs all of us. I enjoyed having this conversation with you. There is so much food for thought there. And I feel that this conversation should continue. And I hope that we will talk again sometime soon. Until then, I wish you all the best and peace be with you.
Thank you so much, Shireen. Same to you.
You've been listening to The D Word, a show about differences. Peace Vigil is an organization dedicated to peace education. You can find more of our resources at peacevigil.net. Today's host was our co-director Shireen, who spoke with Alena Kahle. Please do remember to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends. With that, I'm Samir Dasani, reminding you all that peace needs all of us.